Stray Souls seems like it has everything a horror fan would want. In fact, its hellish creatures, townsfolk cult, and mysteriously empty main street with a malfunctioning fog machine are everything Silent Hill fans in particular could ask for, unabashedly drawing from Konami's iconic horror series. But despite an effectively unsettling opening, pretty much everything else fails to deliver. From its dull combat and cringeworthy conversations to the uninspired boss fights and long list of bugs and glitches. The most impressive thing about Stray Souls ends up being just how badly it manages to fall short of that inspiration by almost every single measure. Stray Souls takes you to Aspen Falls, an unremarkable American town that, brace yourself for this shocker, hides a terrible secret. Ooh. Now, your journey focuses on the newly relocated Daniel, who moved to the community after inheriting a quaint, if run-down home from a grandmother he didn't even know he had. From there, you'll get to know Aspen Falls' sinister, if painfully predictable past through boring combat, overly long exposition dumps, and townsfolk that should really stop leaving evidence of their dark secrets lying around. Now, the town can admittedly be stuffed with wonderful detail at times, and Stray Souls manages to open with a bang, quite literally. Without spoiling much, the opening sequence is stunning in all the right ways, a deliciously grim and very bloody way to set the stage. But for every one of Stray Souls' positives, there are like 20 negatives, and it doesn't take long before its clear promise starts to disintegrate. It's hard to accept Daniel for the ordinary guy he purports to be when he doesn't seem to react to the horrors around him in a convincing or plausible way, and harder still to understand him or his choices as a result. For example, when his companion and new neighbor Martha reveals she's brought a gun to protect them, he freaks out and insists he's never even held one before. But when he pulls it out 30 seconds later, he's strutting around the place like he's Leon S. Kennedy in combat rolling out of harm's way. Now later, he screams cringeworthy one-liners like this.
I've got a bullet with your name on it right here!
Then just moves on with his day instead of immediately calling poor Martha to let her know creatures just broke out of the forest overgrowth to attack him. Now, Martha, too, is bland and unconvincing, and their relationship dissolves into awkward jokes and overfamiliar banter just minutes after they first meet. Now, you'll quickly figure out that their closeness goes beyond mere geography, but even that isn't enough to explain why these characters behave the way they do. Learning about their discoveries through their conversations instead of having to rely on notes and journals full of terminally long lore dumps is at least appreciated, but Martha ultimately comes across as shallow, predictable, and, well, a bit useless overall. She'll even appear and disappear at will, apparently able to throw her voice so that you can keep chatting even when she's nowhere to be seen. Despite wearing its love for Silent Hill so proudly on its sleeve, it feels as though Stray Souls misses much of what makes those games memorable. It can look and sound the part at times, thanks in no small part to the dreamy, dreary score of Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka. Now, there's no denying the dread you'll feel when the music ramps up to signal a fight is afoot. But the combat itself is floaty and uneven, not least because Danny sways all over the place when looking down sights, making it unnecessarily difficult to land a shot. And while those monsters do look cool, their designs seem very disconnected from anything going on around them. Now, combat is further hampered by the lack of an inventory system, which means there's no way to reread the notes and clues you've picked up, nor space to carry extra health items around with you. Now, generally, that won't matter because the fights are pitifully slow, but a couple of close-quarter boss encounters became particularly frustrating when there were no health pickups to be found. And yet, outside of those few moments where there's suddenly not enough healing, most of the time, you'll be running past dozens and dozens of identical copy and pasted ammo crates and health boxes you'll never actually use. Speaking of which, in a tight spot, well, feeling a little overwhelmed, well, just keep running. Enemy AI is laughably poor. They often can't seem to cross a doorway to get you, and if you pull your foes far enough away from their initial spawn point, they will, quite literally, spontaneously combust. Stray Souls has a handful of dialogue choices, but it's not clear what, if any, impact they have on the story being told. For instance, after crashing with Martha for the night, perhaps the only sensible thing Daniel does in the entire game, they inexplicably decide to drive to a cemetery to uncover more information about his mysterious past. En route, they have a long conversation about the true fate of his family, and Daniel can reply to these revelations in one of two equally pointless ways. Now, Martha's response could have followed either option, which makes you wonder why you're given such choices like this at all. Not only your final choice seems to have any meaningful impact, affecting which of three equally unsatisfying endings you get, but the story doesn't quite make sense no matter what you choose. By the time you finish up the 8 to 12 hour adventure, you still won't really understand the motivation of the townsfolk or its cult any more than you'll understand why the fog becomes a sentient barrier as solid as rock at times. There are just so many ways Stray Souls consistently fall short. Puzzles are actually admirably hands-off, leaving you to get on with it with as little guidance as possible, but that means they'll occasionally fall on the wrong side of frustrating. Boss fights are agonizingly dull, where you're forced to take on bloated bullet sponges one after another, combat rolling consistently to avoid damage. And who on earth would think using R3 to roll was a good idea without a way to remap it? Now, these may seem like small things in isolation, but string them together, and Stray Souls crumbles into a pile of random jump scares and spooky creatures that frustrate far more than they frighten. That's all before we even get to performance, and Stray Souls is horrendously buggy. Now, sometimes it's little issues, like when you're told to defeat all the monsters only to realize one has spawned inside a building you can't access. That's crazy, right? It's insane. Now, other times it's huge things like being completely unable to aim at or target the first boss. Now, even small quality of life stuff is flawed or missing entirely, like there being no health bars for bosses or no way to enlarge the laughably tiny subtitles. It's almost impossible to play for more than a couple of minutes at a time without being reminded of just how rough Stray Souls feels. It's such a shame to see some real potential here through all the muck too, perhaps best exemplified by a note you can find abandoned in an alleyway. All too simple to overlook and easily dismiss as another terminally boring lore dump with embarrassingly poor grammar. It's a delight to realize that the random capitalizations are not random at all, actually hiding a wonderfully creepy secret message. Moments like this offer brief flashes of what Stray Souls could have been if that care had been shown to the whole campaign. But they are few and far between, and instead you're left with a crushingly disappointing horror game that's not fun, not scary, and not really worth your time. But hey, at least Daniel doesn't have a stamina bar. Despite a generally unsettling introductory chapter, Stray Souls is an ambitious but unsatisfying horror game that never quite gets going. Its characters are shallow and uninteresting. And while the sights and sounds of its world can be impressive, the mystery that unravels within it is left unsatisfyingly dangling and told mostly through boring exposition dumps. With poor optimization, zero polish, and some of the dullest bosses you'll ever have the displeasure of fighting, Stray Souls is its own worst enemy, destroying its own subtlety with inelegant scares and tedious combat. For some much better scares that are out there, check out our review of Alan Wake 2, or for an even worse adventure, our review of Skull Island: Rise of Kong. Woo! And for everything else, stick with IGN.